Everyone loves legendary creatures, which represent unique individuals from the Magic story, and over the years they've become even more important in the game, with Commander becoming the most popular format. Since they represent important figures in the story, legendary creatures also tend to be powerful, and they often have unique, interesting effects. Blue legendary creatures in particular tend to be good at grinding out a bunch of value, or giving you powerful payoffs for having lots of artifacts or casting instants and sorceries, and indeed some of the best legendary creatures in the game are blue. If you're curious just how good they've been, I have done a top 10 on the subject. However, not all blue legendary creatures are good, and many of them aren't fit to be played as your commander or in 60 card formats, and those are the exact kinds of cards we'll be looking at today, Magic's worst blue legendary creatures. This video is sponsored by Card Kingdom. Use the links in the description to visit their store. At number 10, it's Alhammarret High Arbiter. For 5 generic and 2 blue, it's a 5/5 flyer, and when it enters, each opponent reveals their hand and you choose a non-land card revealed this way, and your opponents can't cast spells with the chosen name. So to start with, a 7 mana 5/5 flyer is not a good rate, and while we'll see much worse stat lines in this video as we move up the list, that doesn't somehow make Alhammarret's acceptable. The Arbiter's Into the Battlefield ability also isn't particularly impressive. By the time you play it, it's kind of unlikely your opponent has all that many cards in their hand, and while it's nice to imagine naming the removal spell in their hand so that they can't kill your flyer, it doesn't happen as often as you want it to. For this amount of mana, Alhammarret should let you choose any card name while still getting a look at your opponent's hand to make it even easier for you to find something to name. If you could go with any card name, that would mean you could do stuff like name commanders or name a powerful card you know your opponent has in their deck, as opposed to just being restricted to the cards that are in your opponent's hand. But as it is, Alhammarret is usually just a 7 mana 5/5 flyer with very minor upside that is frequently irrelevant, and that's just not a card you want to play. At number 9, it's Ferny, Bree, Swindler. For 1 generic and a blue, it's a 2/1, and when it becomes blocked, you either create a treasure, or you can give your opponent a horse you control, and then Bill untaps and gets removed from combat, and you create 3 treasure tokens. The design here is pretty great in terms of flavor. The idea that you can sell your opponent a bad horse for value is pretty hilarious, but unfortunately Ferny isn't actually a good card. While it has a more passable stat line than many of the creatures on the list, his blocked trigger is super weak to have on a 2 mana 2/1. Sure, treasure is nice, but you often find yourself in a spot where your opponent can just block and kill Bill outright without you killing their creature, and giving up a whole card for a single treasure definitely isn't what you want to be doing. Bill has to trade for his trigger to be good, and that's hard with a 2/1. If you manage to run it out on 2, it has a better chance at being relevant, but even then it isn't like letting 2 damage through is going to concern your opponent in most cases. The horse upside is also incredibly difficult to pull off, and it isn't even always worth giving your opponent a horse for 3 treasure, especially in the later stages of the game, even if Bill does survive in that case. Unlike the other 9 cards on the list, we not only have data from EDH and 60 card formats to show us how bad Bill is, we've also got data about Limited. 17 Lands is a website that tracks win rates of arena players and the win rates of individual cards. The other cards in this list don't have that kind of data because they're so old, but Ferny does. It has a 52.5% win rate in its limited format, which might not sound that bad, but players who sign up to have 17 lands track their data have a higher than normal win rate, and the average win rate on 17 lands is 55.6%, and Bill's win rate of a full 4 points lower than that is absolutely horrendous. And if you'd rather go off of comparison than win rate alone, we can do that too. Bill has the 71st highest win rate among 80 uncommons, and the 33rd highest win rate among all blue cards. So yeah, Bill is just as terrible in Limited as he is in Commander and 60 card formats. At number 8, it's Lu-Su-Wu Advisor. For 3 generic and 2 blue, he's a 1/2, and you can tap him to draw a card, but you can only activate the ability during your turn before attackers are declared. While you might be saying, hey wait, it doesn't have the tap ability as a cost, can't I draw my first card the turn he comes down? And the answer is no. Although you are correct that if the tap symbol isn't part of the cost, you would normally be able to use it despite summoning sickness, but Lu-Su-Wu Advisor is from a very strange set. Portal 3 Kingdoms. It was originally introduced as a standalone set that was an introductory product for Magic, and it had simplified rules, and one of those things was not including activated abilities as we know them in mainstream Magic. But when Portal 3 Kingdoms cards became part of mainstream Magic in 2005, they eroded the cards to match up more with the rest of Magic, and Lusu has to tap to draw you that card according to its Oracle text. Anyway, Lusu can draw you an extra card every turn, but the fact he can only do it during your own turn before attackers are declared is a pretty big restriction, especially on a 5-mana 1/2. Because of how he works, Lusu may as well be an enchantment that draws you a card at the beginning of combat every turn, since he's rarely going to be attacking or blocking, but he's much more vulnerable than a non-creature enchantment would be as a result of a horrendous stat line. At number 7, it's Reveka, Wizard Savant. For 2 generic and 2 blue, she's an absolutely horrendous 0/1, but she does come with an activated ability. You can tap her to do 2 damage to any target, which, hey, is actually a pretty nice ability to have, but Reveka also doesn't untap during your next untap step when you use her ability. So yeah, a 4-mana 0/1 that can tap to do 2 damage to anything would actually be a pretty nice card, one that can overcome its terrible stat line, but when she also has to freeze herself down to use that ability, it means that she's only using it every other turn, while having a body that is super irrelevant in most cases. At number 6, it's Blind Seer. Fun fact, this creature is actually Urza in disguise, and for a long time it was the only card that actually represented Urza as an individual. Apparently, despite all of Urza's power in the lore, while he was disguised, he wasn't very impressive. He's 2 generic and 2 blue for a 3/3, and you can pay 1 generic and a blue to have target spell or permanent become the color of your choice until end of turn. 4-mana 3/3s weren't quite as bad back in the early 2000s as they are today, but because his ability is so narrow, in most situations he may as well not have the ability at all. Changing the color of something really only matters if you have color hosing cards, so that you can make your blue elemental blast hit any permanent, for example, and while it's cool and fun to play around with the color of permanents, it's not a great strategy because if you ever don't have the Seer around, all your color hosers become useless. The Blind Seer is the most heavily played card on the list when it comes to being a commander, but that has a lot more to do with being a fun, wacky way to play than it does with building a deck that will win a lot. And even though it's heavily played in Commander compared to the rest of the list, it's still the 1,297th most popular commander on EDHREC, which is still pretty bad. At number 5, it's Tomorrow Azami's Familiar. For 5 generic and a blue, it's a 1/5, and if you would draw a card, you look at the top 3 cards of your library instead and put one of those cards into your hand and the rest on the bottom of your library in any order. The text box isn't bad, although I do think it's easy to overrate. Card selection is good and all, but it's way worse than straight up drawing a card, and if I'm playing a 6-mana 1/5, I would much rather draw an extra card with this effect than just get a choice from among my top 3 cards. Still, if Tomorrow was more reasonably costed and or statted, it would be a pretty okay card as that ability is nice upside to have, but a 1/5 is pretty miserable, especially when you're spending 6 mana on it. At number 4, it's the Unspeakable. For 6 generic and 2 blue, it's a 6/7 with flying and trample, and whenever it deals combat damage to a player, you can return target arcane card from your graveyard to your hand. 9 mana for this creature is super underwhelming. The stats aren't great for such a massive cost, and the ability to return arcane spells is way too narrow. Arcane is a spell subtype that was introduced in original Kamigawa block, but it hasn't received very many cards since then, and many of them really aren't worth returning to your hand in the first place. Now, there is an alternate way to get the Unspeakable into play, but it asks a lot. If you cast 3 specific arcane spells in a single turn, those being Reach Through Mists, Peer Through Depths, and finally Sift Through Sands, you get to tutor up the Unspeakable and put it directly into play, and because those spells are arcane, you'll even have stuff to get back. Only problem is, having to cast 3 specific spells, and in the right order too, isn't exactly easy, and even if you do put the Unspeakable into play this way, you're still spending 6 mana, which yeah, is a more reasonable cost, but it also isn't going to feel insane, especially because you have to keep him alive for 1 whole turn before he ever does anything. Basically, the Unspeakable is too expensive to cast normally, too hard to cast using 3 specific spells, and even when it is in play, it's rarely going to be putting that much fear into anyone, since your typical arcane spell is so underwhelming. At number 3, it's Taniwha. For 3 generic and 2 blue, it's a 7/7. Now we're talking. That's some efficiency for sure, and it even has trample, but it also has 2 very big downsides. First, it has phasing, which means it either phases in or out before you untap every turn, and when it's phased out, it's treated as if it doesn't exist. In other words, Taniwha is really only relevant on the board about half the time, but it gets even worse, because it does the same thing to your lands. So you only get to have your lands available about half the time too. And keep in mind, none of this is the same as blinking. You don't get landfall triggers or anything like that. They remain on the battlefield, but they're treated as if they aren't there. So the downside is just too much here, even when what you're getting is a 5 mana 7/7 with trample. While it is the most heavily played card on the list, at least when we're talking about it appearing as a card in a deck and not as a commander, this is because Taniwha is played in decks that have a commander that lets you give your opponent your stuff, like John Irenicus, which kind of proves my point. Playing Taniwha is going to make it very difficult for you to win since it wreaks such havoc on your mana. At number 2, it's Zhou, Chief Commander. For 5 generic and 2 blue, he's an 8/8, so like Taniwha, we have a pretty efficient creature, but of course this one comes with a pretty hefty downside. It can't attack unless your opponent controls an island. Ouch. So, much of the time, this is effectively a 7 mana 8/8 with Defender, and that's not something you ever want to spend that much mana on. It is true that blue possesses many ways to make opposing lands into islands, but that's a pretty significant hoop to jump through when the only upside is a vanilla 7 mana 8/8. And at number 1, it's Hisoka Minamo Sensei. For 2 generic and 2 blue, it's a 1/3, and you can pay 2 generic and a blue and discard a card to counter a spell with the same mana value as the discarded card. Repeatable counterspells are great, but Hisoka's ability is just way too narrow. You have to have mana up at the right time, you have to have a card in your hand at the right time, and it needs to have the exact mana value of whatever you're trying to counter, or the ability is meaningless, and as I'm sure you can guess, his ability is useless about 90% of the time. And that's a bad place to be, since he's a miserable 4 mana 1/3. That total package is enough to make Hisoka Minamo Sensei the worst blue legendary creature in all of Magic history. So, those are my picks for the worst blue legendary creatures. Do you want to prove me wrong and build a sweet commander deck around one of them? If so, check out the description where you can find a direct Card Kingdom link for each card that appeared in the video. If you want to make sure you catch future videos, don't forget to subscribe. And if you want to catch up on past videos, including many more that look at the worst cards in the game, including more that look at the worst legendary creatures in other colors, you should see a playlist on your screen shortly. Thanks for watching.